Welcome to the Taking Back Public Power community chat brought to you by Sunrise SG and Democratic Socialists of America San Diego chapter. My name is Saska, she, her gender pronouns, and I'm speaking to you live from the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, also known as San Diego. We are here today to have a conversation about public power and what a publicly owned gas and electric utility would mean for San Diego. Joining us today is Johanna Bozuwa, she, her, co-manager of the Climate and Energy Program at the Democracy Collective. Johanna's expertise includes research and work on energy democracy, which seeks not to only solve the climate crisis, but also address systemic inequality. Welcome, Johanna.
Thank
Please
you
tell
so
us.
much for having me.
Yes, glad to have you. Please tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started in this work, and what projects you are currently working on.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. The way that I got particularly into this work is I worked for a nonprofit getting out of college and had this realization that it wasn't actually helping us with the issues of climate change. It was more scurrying around than dealing with the systemic nature of the problem. And so I actually went to grad school and I was like, you know what, this is going to do it. We're going to talk about sustainable business and how we need to change our economy. Once I got there, it was like another attempt at it was much more focused on greenwashing than it was about that systemic change. And I also started to do much more fighting against fossil fuel infrastructure because it was so clear that that's where some of the deepest inequities were being felt. Both particularly at the time I was in the Netherlands, and Shell is this kind of very clear example of colonialism, of injustice, and of extraction. And so as I was kind of gaining more work in activism, I was going through that same experience of my master's where I was like, you know what, this is not going to be the answer. And so at the end of my time there, I actually started to investigate public ownership versus investor-owned utilities in providing our basic services. And through that investigation in the United States, I came to the conclusion that public power actually is a very powerful tool for us to use, because it means that we, the people, are actually in charge. And that means that we get to fight more effectively for the things that our communities deserve, like climate justice, affordable energy, and so many of those things. So now I really commit a huge amount of my time to the fight for public power and how that intersects with the concept of energy democracy and the vision and values of energy democracy. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you, Seska, and I'm so excited to see what's happening in San Diego.
Yes, thank you for telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work. So right now we are in a historic moment in San Diego, which has sparked this conversation. As it has for a century, San Diego Gas and Electric holds both electric and gas franchise agreements. Under the current franchise agreement, the city gives San Diego Gas and Electric a license to operate within city limits by allowing it exclusive use of public right-of-way for transmission and distribution, as well as the right to install and maintain wires, poles, power lines, and underground gas and electric lines. And the current agreement has been in place since 1970, but the 50-year deal expires in January 2021, and a longtime San Diego institution is coming to an end. And it's now time for a fresh start. And so San Diego Gas and Electric and Sempra Energy are investor-owned utilities, or what we call IOUs, that have corporate stakeholders that are in charge of public goods like energy. SDG&E charges residents the highest rates in all of California, almost twice as much as what the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD, charges. And so, Johanna, how do rates compare to what you've seen nationally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the investor-owned utility model is inherently based off of profiting off basic services and like basic human rights. And so they are making guaranteed rates of return by, guaranteed by the state or the city. And in a public power system, that actually isn't true. We are, able to, have things that are at cost, for instance. And so you see across the United States that public power is actually often cheaper than investor-owned utility service areas. And it also allows for a lot of really interesting things to be done in terms of thinking about how we think of those basic services. So, for instance, in Seattle, Washington, which has a publicly owned utility, they actually have the first lot of energy for everyone at a cheaper rate than the later one. So it means that everyone is getting a basic service at a cheaper amount to try to make it more affordable. So it really allows, those are types of things that we don't see often with investor owned utilities, that you actually have you have the opportunity as as the community or as policymakers to really push for in ways that might not be true with an investor owned utility.
And with that said, what's the process for the fight for public power?
Yeah, so I'll start off that question by saying that there are actually San Diego is one of many campaigns that are getting off the ground right now. I think a lot of communities are so sick of investor-owned utilities, both stymieing, the fight for climate justice, stymieing the distribution of renewable energy, resilient energy, and are sick also of the unaffordable rates and the energy injustice and energy burdens we see. So that is why we're seeing a lot of different places take up campaigns for municipalization or even a state level takeover for public power. And it really is about, I mean, the first step here, and you all at Sunrise Movement and DSA are doing this, is organizing. It's about organizing your community and putting forth that vision for like what public power and what it means to own your utility. The other thing you have to do is there are multiple pathways for public power municipalization or takeovers of some sort, depending on the context of your community and the legal laws that are there. You all are in a position in which the franchise agreement is up. And that is a really helpful leverage point to say, actually, we want to do something very different, as you were saying, Seska. So then you can actually you can pass legislation that is calling for this to be investigated and to be pursued. And often a first step is a feasibility study to see what the cost of buying something out like this could be, and kind of moving forward. But along all of these steps across the way, it is all about people power. It's about getting your community involved and showing that, like talking with folks to understand what about SDG&E, what about your investor-owned utility is creating harm in your community, and then working alongside them to articulate a vision of what public power could do differently. So, that it really does depend on the community and the, political context and even the laws. So doing investigation about that is really important early on. And I think it is like using people power is like the most important component.
Thank you. And yeah, you mentioned earlier about Seattle, about an example. Can you about another city, either nationally or globally, that has transitioned from a corporate utility to a publicly owned utility? And have you seen benefits from them?
Mm, yeah, a great question and always really helpful to use examples. In recent history, one of the things that has been very hard about investor owned utilities is they have a huge amount of political power. And so for a long time, they have worked very hard to quash municipalization campaigns. However, one of the most recent ones in electricity is Winter Park, Florida, that was sick of the kind of rate extortion that they were experiencing financing. And so in about, I think it was 2007 to 2008, they were able to municipalize their utility, bring their utility into their own city, and they saw rate decreases pretty quickly after that. Similarly, in Jefferson County in Washington, they also were able to take back for the entire county the electricity provision, and that helped them achieve both their clean energy goals as well as making rates more affordable and more accessible. There are also very historical examples in the era of the New Deal, which is actually when we saw, and we're talking a lot about the Green New Deal right now, but back in the New Deal times, there actually utilities were a huge part of the fight. And we'll see that again as we're all working towards local Green New Deals, towards federal Green New Deals. But in the original New Deal, one of the things that was being fought for was public power and cooperative power. So actually in that era is when the state of Nebraska actually expelled all investor-owned utilities from the state. And so ever since that era, they have been operating with a fully public power state, that is operating relatively efficiently. And, depending on the community, there have been really big fights for climate justice and investing in climate solutions. So, for instance, Omaha Public Power District, they have an elected board for their utility, which gives them a huge amount of power. So, over the past few years, climate advocates have campaigned for those spots and have actually gotten themselves installed on the board. And because of that, we've seen their fight and transition for more clean power. So, I think that there are examples, old and new. The investor-owned utilities have a huge amount of power, and as we go into these fights, we have to be aware of them. But we're seeing with more and more municipalization campaigns coming that investor-owned utilities are scared, and they're scared of what we are going to be able to do. And I think that's actually showing that our movement is winning, and these are winnable options, and it can give us real results. And I'll say one last thing before we move on. Actually, if you look at some of the stats in terms of the cities or utilities that have gone 100% renewable, right now, those are only cities or service territories that are fully publicly owned or cooperatively owned. So, I think that it does give you flexibility to really fight for these things that we want, like energy democracy.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up flexibility and accountability. So, SCG&E recently hit residents with blackouts during a heat wave this past summer. Is there a difference in the reliability of service or resiliency during weather events between private and public utilities?
Yeah, another great question. And I think the answer here, I'll look to PG&E, which you all know intimately well. So PG&E basically did not invest in its transmission services or its infrastructure. And that is one of the reasons that, we had so many of the wildfires 2 years ago. And it was a very clear issue of negligence. They were more interested in, giving their CEOs big bucks and getting money to their shareholders than they were actually investing in that infrastructure. And also some of the ways that they make their money don't actually allow for investment in the things that we need, like making sure that we have a safe grid. They want to build, not take care of and steward. And so I think the difference here that we see with public ownership is particularly when you're starting your own publicly owned utility, is that you get to set the grounds. You get to re-envision what it means to have a utility, an energy utility in your space. So that means that you can integrate a framework of resilience, a framework of, energy democracy in there, and reliability being paramount, particularly as a place that is more prone to wildfires. So, there might, across the United States, we do see that publicly owned utilities are more reliable. And as you're starting right now, I think there's this huge opportunity to rethink what a utility needs to be and what it needs to be in terms of accountability to its community. And one last thing on this, when it came to PG&E, is the fact that they have been able to so effectively lobby and campaign for their perspective as a privately owned institution. In the end, they are able to, push lobbyists at the state legislature, get them in the door, and have spent millions upon millions of dollars to do so, so that they aren't held accountable. With a publicly owned utility, it is owned by you. And, that doesn't mean that it's perfect. We have to be cognizant of that. Like, the end of the organizing feat is, it's not when we get the publicly owned utility. We need to, keep vigilance. We need to keep on making sure that our public utility is doing what communities need. But there are so many more options for accountability there that you can use, from my perspective. And I think that that will help us to achieve those reliability goals and make sure that folks are not left out of that vision.
Thank you. Yes, and at Sunrise, we acknowledge that the climate crisis has been hitting frontline communities that have been sounding the alarm about the devastation caused by this extractive, profit-driven institutions, right? And in the US, we are experiencing huge disparities and wealth gaps between Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So, how would you say that public power addresses racial and environmental inequity?
Mm. Yes, this is paramount. And I think when it comes to this, it again is the fact that public ownership is a flexible enterprise in some regards, much more so than investor owned utilities, that like profit is something that drives them at the end of the day. That doesn't actually have to be true for public ownership. It is actually there to serve like a basic human right, to serve like the community that owns it, which is you all. And so that means that as you're building the vision for what your utility is, you need to embed, climate justice. You need to embed the fact that like it is going to prioritize folks who have been left out of the transition, that's going to prioritize BIPOC communities that have, experienced so much harm over the years, both by the energy system, but by like the larger economic systems at play and the extraction we see. So, I think as you all at Sunrise Movement and DSA, in across the movement that is fighting for this, is to think about what is the infrastructure we actually need in a utility to serve those goals, and that can be a range of different things. How much money that you want to invest in affordable housing and efficiency. Making sure that any renewable energy program is accessible and is building jobs for folks who have been left out. It also, another example an example to draw from is in Paris. They municipalized their water, or made their water public, recently, only I would say about 10 years ago. And they integrated some of the most democratic processes for a utility, in which they have an observatory that like has to go, basically decisions have to go through the entirety of the community before they can be decided upon by a board, a multi-stakeholder board that has people from community development, has workers on that board, has public officials. So there are ways for us to build equity in, and then it's also about being vigilant once the public institution is running too.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up building that in the infrastructure and the topic of how decisions are being made. And here in San Diego, the city council and the mayor have moved forward with the invitation to bid and show little interest in a publicly owned utility. And the city is slow to consider a publicly owned utility due to special interest.
Mm.
So, for In 2015 through 2018, Sempra, the parent company of SDG&E, made campaign contributions to candidates for 28 of city councils and county commissions that have passed balanced energy resolutions. The LA Times found part of 4.1 million in total political contributions by Sempra over those 4 years. And so how did other jurisdictions in the country work to get money out of politics to achieve a publicly owned utility?
Yeah, the description that you're giving in terms of how SDG&E has influenced politics is definitely one we see across the U.S. and is from a playbook. Like it is true, literally from a playbook that Edison Electric Institute, their kind of industry um, eh, convener has put together, and they have found incredibly effective ways to divide community, either through campaign contributions, through lobbying, but even through things like strategic philanthropy, so that it becomes hard to build power against investor-owned utilities, and they're incredibly effective at doing that. But we've seen places where we have seen the breakdown of that power happening. One very personal example I'll give is in Washington, D.C., we have PEPCO is the utility there, which is a subsidiary of Exelon, one of the biggest investor-owned utilities in the United States. And the first part of our campaign was actually about letting people know that this influence is real, and that we're going to stand up to it. So we created the No Pepco Pledge, which said that that we asked campaigns to sign on to, that said that they would promise not to take any money from Pepco or any fossil fuel companies at all. It said that they would also take detailed notes for any lobbying meeting they ever had with those people, so that they could be we could use FOIAs, or Freedom of Information Acts, to see exactly what happened in those meetings. And then third, they committed to investigating public power in the District of Columbia. And so by doing that, we were able to activate new constituencies and let people know that this is actually a pervasive problem in the district, that PEPCO is affecting us. And so now we're moving into our next phase, in which we're fighting for public power. And we now have folks who have taken that No PEPCO pledge, that are now in power in our city council, that can be our advocates and be our allies. In just down the road in Virginia, it's also a very compelling example. They have not been fighting for public power there, but they have been able to very systematically eliminate the power of Dominion. Dominion is an investor-owned utility that is like truly, I mean, there are a lot of IOUs out there that are baddies. These are like pretty close to my like number two. They're like top five, we'll say. They're like totally top five evil. Like they have co-opted the entire like state of Virginia. They are trying to, put pipelines through people's backyards. Run the whole gamut, and they had full control over the state legislature. Anything they wanted passed for many years, they got. And that's because they were so effective at both giving money to Republicans, but also very effectively Democrats. And that meant that they were very protected. But they actually ran a pledge in Virginia that said that was an anti-Dominion pledge, that they would not take money or not be influenced by them. And that, alongside some really incredible organizing on behalf of like young folks and people in the state, they have been able to shift the legislature, oust people who were, like Dominion had their claws into, and create a very different condition for climate bills in Virginia. And so now they've been able to actually push through legislation that's helping them achieve their climate goals is increasing, systems of energy democracy, like distributed renewable energy. And I think that that is an incredible articulation of like what it means to break down that power. And I'll say just one last thing here is the fact that it's very good to note that once you get that public power, they don't have the same level of influence because they can't spend money on campaign contributions because they're a public institution. Um, they still have some amount of influence. That's like not something that we can blanket over, but it means that it's so much less. And it's really makes a huge amount of difference in terms of you being able to be the one that's advocating on behalf of your community instead of having to constantly fight these like huge amount of money that's coming through and is pulling through with investor-owned utilities.
Yeah, and it seems that there is a disconnect between what science is telling us and the lack of bold actions by our leaders to address the climate crisis, and that would help exponentially. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or as we know, the IPCC, has called for unprecedented levels of mobilization to address the climate crisis. And so, how would transitioning to public power help us reach net zero carbon emissions by 2030?
So I think there are a few different ways that this happens, and like why public power can be an important part of that transition. Number one, as we've talked about before, y'all are creating public power from the ground up, and so that means that you don't have the same like commitment to those stranded assets that those fossil fuel or like other utilities are used to, or the grid infrastructure that's been built to date. You actually get to design and decide what you want that future utility to look like. And that means that you can like imbue energy democracy into that vision, which I think is very powerful. Another thing is that, investor-owned utilities have been known for using that lobbying money, those campaign contributions to roll back climate issues and issues that we see around affordability. They're always trying to raise rates on us, and then on the when they're not fighting us to keep their fossil fuel companies running, or their bad grid infrastructure running for their centralized system, they're actually now trying to make money off of the renewable energy transition and say, you know what, that new utility, solar utility scale solar, we want to make like 17% return on investment on that. And the state, need to guarantee that for us, so that we can take the risk. But we don't need it to be that way. And so by actually with investor-owned utilities, we run the risk of not only not meeting our goals when it comes to climate action and the energy transition, but we also run the risk of perpetuating similar harm and extractive tendencies in a renewable energy system, where an investor-owned utility is extracting that money, extracting using their aggressive tactics to get the things they want, instead of these things being collectively owned by the community, being in service to the community, decisions around these being made by the community. And that's the vision that I want when I think about the energy transition. I want it to lift people up. I want them to have jobs. I want it to inject and build a vibrant economy in my community. And I'm afraid that with an investor-owned utility model, we won't get that. And then I think another piece of this is a little bit of pure math, where when it comes to publicly owned utilities, it means they get access to cheaper money basically when they borrow, like government bonds, in comparison to going and getting money off the market and then having to be, beholden to those shareholders at the end of the day. So that actually means that sometimes investing via like public institutions is actually a cheaper way of doing it too, when it comes to the renewable energy transition. But I think like for me, the most compelling part is who owns that transition and how, like, what that means for workers and it means for people who have been left out of our economy to date.
Yeah, and getting a little bit more on, I guess, the technical side. So SDG and E doesn't necessarily generate the electricity that it supplies us with. Could you explain how the way a utility owns and manages a grid relates with efforts to decarbonize our electric generation?
Totally. The grid is so important now. The grid is more important than ever. We need to electrify so much of our system. Think about like all of the, if we're moving to electric vehicles, if we're moving to more electrified public transit, if we're, getting all of those systems off gas, that's a huge amount of electrification that's happening. So owning the grid is so important. So it's important to, own the renewable energy infrastructure, make sure that is accessible. But then also it has so much to do with like how we're setting up our grid for success and making sure that it's not stymieing our transition. So a couple examples here. One thing that we often see with investor-owned utilities that are pissed that they have to have like distributed renewable energy on the market or like on someone's home, what they'll do is they will slow walk the process so much that it'll take you 2 to 3 years to even get solar on your roof. So they use really effective tactics to stop the transition, and that's why actually owning the grid is so important. And I think there are other pieces here too. When it comes, like right now, we're amidst COVID-19 pandemic, so many people are having to work from home, are having to work, have school from home, and what we see often is with publicly owned electric utilities, it also makes it very easy to create public broadband. And right now we see a huge amount of like we have a monopoly when it comes to our internet services and our broadband services that have meant huge number of people have been shut off. And that's like totally unacceptable right now. So what you're seeing is the integration of broadband and electrification happening at the same time and serving communities much better when it's publicly owned and you get to make those decisions together. So I think it both allows us to be faster. It allows us to make sure like that how we do that electrification is done in a just way. And I think it allows us to think about a more integrated system too when we have, public control over it, since so much will be electrified in the future.
Yeah, and it seems that going on to our next question, has corporate energy in the US been effective in meeting its emission goals, and why or why not?
No. No, everyone's behind. Like it really is. I mean, we really need to step up the game right now. What it's not 12 years, it's 10 years really now, in order to stay under 1.5. And that's why we need to see ratcheting up of ambition, and we need to make sure that that is also aligned with justice because we can't just pay lip service. We need that to happen now. And investor-owned utilities have shown they're not up to snuff. And I think also the places where we have seen investor-owned utilities maybe step up a little bit more is actually where they've been threatened by municipalization campaigns. So I think municipalization and the fight for public power will give us a much better chance of actually achieving those goals both from a perspective of justice as well as a perspective of achieving those goals, those climate goals.
Yeah, and if you can speak a little bit more of how publicly owned utilities have higher reliability rates and how we can, if we do have a public power, then it could set a baseline and kind of expand on that.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to the reliability components, what is really powerful about the public power model is the amount of like community planning that can be built into that system. And like, the fact that you all get to be a part of that in ways that might be different from an investor owned utility areas. If we even look to, this is not specifically about the grid, but it's about the community choice aggregation strategies in, for instance, Oakland. They have built in reliability and distributed renewables into like their business plan, basically, and that puts them on a much higher cutting edge than other places. And I think that that also applies here, where you're able to integrate those pieces of the puzzle to enable more reliability across the board within a public institution. That has to do a huge amount with also integrated systems. So, I'm you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. In San Diego, like when it comes to your public infrastructure, you're talking about your public transit, and you have a like publicly owned utility. Often it can allow for there to be much better systems of integration and collaboration between those different departments in a way that a like privately owned entity actually might not be as willing to join those, or to provide the information, or not speak the same language to a certain degree. So I think that there are some really inspiring components of like building reliability by also having it an integrated system within the local government, for instance.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that you could build in that reliability because we could set our priorities where we attack the climate crisis and our new experience of these increased wildfires. And speaking of wildfires, California has seen several major wildfires started by investor-owned utilities. And PG&E has started 5 since 2015, and SDG&E has started a major fire in 2007, and in their own report forecast a 5% increase or risk, a 5% risk of starting a new one every year. So why are so many fires started by these utility companies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think part of it comes back to the investment and like how decisions are made about those types of things, where it's much more profit driven than it would have to be with a public institution. I think that you are able to like set in many more ways the operating principles, and you can include so much more about fire management and fire safety. And I think like there are even really important tactics that this like city government or like communities could advocate for in terms of relying upon alternative models for taking care of brush, and making sure that like the infrastructure is well cared for, in terms of, working alongside indigenous communities that might be in the area that actually know fire management much better than like an investor owned utility, through like very long histories in these communities. So I think there are ways to think about reliability and like fighting those wildfires in different ways. And like negligence is what led to PG&Es. And it was like greed, basically negligence and greed that led to the PG&E fires. There, like the reality is that we are living in a world in which more fires will happen. Like that is what climate change has done, and it's how we mitigate, how we think through, how we prepare for that, so that people are not shut off from their utilities and as little as possible, and that people are cared for even if that does happen in those moments, so that both you are stopping as many fires as possible, as well as preparing for those moments when they do happen, so that you're ready to react and make sure the folks that are most that are most vulnerable to the experience of fires are the first that are cared for.
Yeah, and we spoke earlier about when you spoke about greed, and a core principle of the Green New Deal is a just transition. So if
Mm.
we do transition, what options are available to ensure job continuity and protections for the workers who have been supplying our utilities under SDG&E?
Yeah. So when it comes to transfers of ownership, usually what we like with the transfer from investor-owned utility to public power, often we've seen that like has allowed folks to continue to be in unionized workplaces, that as many are transferred, utility jobs are transferred over, and that actually in many places across, particularly internationally, it's often unions that are the ones that are advocating for public ownership or public power because they have much more negotiating power when you're operating with the government as compared to private industry. So there's a group called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy that looks at this a lot, actually, and works with a lot of those unions across the world in their fights for public ownership. Um, I also think that as you're fighting for public power, it's also a way to think about like what the future of jobs look like through something like the Green New Deal, and make sure that we are providing opportunities and jobs to folks who have been cut out of the energy industry and like cut out of jobs more generally. We have the ability to also ensure that any jobs that are created through this new public entity are family sustaining wages, are provided, health and safety in ways that they may not have had elsewhere. So I think there's opportunity to both bring in new folks, and make this a jobs oriented proposal, and also make sure that those jobs are high quality, good jobs that are not harmful to our planet as well.
Yeah, and it seems that you're saying that transitioning to a public utility would lead to more green jobs that are sustainable and protect workers.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly, Jessica.
And right now, we are talking to you from the unceded Kumeyaay land. So, how does energy democracy tie into repatriation of
Mm,
Indigenous land
mhm.
and reparations for the damage done to communities? And how can we ensure new energy infrastructure doesn't replicate systems of injustice that we've seen?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this piece up. And I think, again, this really comes down to how you all visualize and design that public institution, because I think that is the thing that really is empowering to me about public ownership is that it is a malleable thing. It like if you all fight for a vision in which like there is repatriation of land and like siting of new infrastructure is always done with like, for instance, free, prior and informed consent as a baseline, but like actually in relationship with indigenous communities that may be living there, or create systems in which reparations can actually occur. I think that those are things that you can think about in terms of what type of legislation you're designing that actually creates the institution you're talking about, or how you embed indigenous representation, for instance, at your utility. So one thing I think I referenced earlier is like the concept of multi-stakeholder boards. And that actually could be one tool that you could see in which, you have workers on your board, you have community advocates on your board. You have affordable housing folks on your board. You also have Indigenous leadership potentially on your board, so that is not something that's left to the side. It is like front and center in decision making, because like who is at the table when decisions are being made makes a like huge amount of difference. It doesn't mean it's everything, but it is part of the system that we can create that can actually help to repair past harm and ensure that particularly in the future we're not doing that again.
Yeah, and it seems like you're saying that publicly owned utilities would allow for Indigenous leadership to be at the table.
Yeah, and I think particularly as you all are organizing and like by centering that in the fight for public power, there is the opportunity to do that in really rad ways. So yeah, exactly.
Thank you. And lastly, can you tell us where our viewers or our comrades could find your work, and tell us of the exciting things you're currently working on, either in your personal life or regarding energy democracy?
Everything is energy democracy I'm working on, baby. Seska, this is awesome. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. And folks should definitely look. I work at the Democracy Collaborative. Often my stuff is under the nextsystem.org. You can find writing and additional research on the issue of public power. I am often fighting both at the national level for fights around the Green New Deal and ensuring that vision of the Green New Deal is like rooted in justice and owning our future in many ways, and the fight for public power and how it relates to the Green New Deal, as well as trying to engage and support different campaigns for public power on the ground, and like help with research or communications as I can. So as the fight in San Diego continues, I would love to kind of be in support as I can and like do the research that I can for you all. And if you're looking for more information, like you can follow me on Twitter, which my Twitter handle is Johanna Bozuwa, my name. And then also on thenextsystem.org. Both of those places are probably good spots to find my research.
Thank you. And before we log off, I would like to invite everyone joining us today for our upcoming events. On Monday, 6 p.m., October 12th, you can join Sunrise and DSA and the Sarah Davis for State Assembly campaign for a virtual karaoke night. This should be a fun event. I love karaoke. And I love Sarah Davis. She is a Green New Deal and Medicare for All candidate. And you could find more information about that at votesarahdavis.com, voteforsarahdavis.com. And next, if you are interested in getting involved with Sunrise and are looking for a place in the movement, join us at our team's breakout meeting where we discuss ongoing projects like political action and more. This will be on Thursday, 7 p.m., October 15th, and you could sign up usually at our Facebook page, Sunrise Movement San Diego. And again, I thank you to our comrades joining us at home this beautiful Saturday. And thank you, Johanna. It is such a pleasure to chat with you, and we're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Seska. It's been so wonderful chatting with you, and I look forward to seeing this campaign grow and like build in power.
All right, thank you.